Today, we are diving into the absolutely epic 2,200-year story of Rome. Now, this is a civilization that, at its height, ruled over nearly a fifth of all people on Earth. And its legacy? Well, from the buildings we design to the way we talk about politics, it still shapes our world in ways we don't even realize.
I mean, really think about it for a second. So much of our political language is Roman, words like Senate, Republic, even veto. And our whole concept of a professional standing army, that was pretty much their idea. So the big question is, how did an empire that's been gone for over 1,500 years end up building the world we live in today?
And that gets us to the core idea of this whole story. The fall of Rome wasn't as simple as a bunch of barbarians showing up at the gates. It's a story of self-destruction. It's this wild paradox, right? The very things that made Rome this unstoppable powerhouse, its incredible ambition, its ruthless pragmatism, its calculated use of violence, those were also the seeds of its own destruction.
Okay, so to really get Rome, you have to go right back to the beginning, because the story of how it was founded isn't just some dusty old myth. It's basically the blueprint for its entire crazy history. It reveals a violent, contradictory character that would define it for 1,000 years.
I mean, just look at this timeline. The scale of Roman history is just mind-boggling. It starts as this tiny mythical kingdom. Then it transforms into a republic that lasts for 500 years, and then it becomes an empire that dominates the world for another 5 centuries in the West. It's an incredible journey.
All right, so let's talk about how Rome started. Like a lot of ancient places, its origin story is pure legend. But here's the thing, this isn't just some fairy tale. It tells you a fundamental, and honestly, a pretty brutal truth about what it meant to be Roman right from day one.
You've probably heard the story, right? Twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, supposedly raised by a she-wolf. When it was time to build their city, they argued about where to put it. But this wasn't some friendly disagreement. It ended with Romulus, the pragmatic one, killing his brother Remus in cold blood. Think about that. The city of Rome was literally born from one brother murdering the other.
And that single, brutal act set the stage for everything that followed. It established the core principle of what it meant to be Roman: violence for a purpose. The idea that you could and should use force in a calculated way to achieve your goals. This one idea is going to drive everything they do. And they didn't waste any time putting this idea to the test. The new city had a big problem: not enough women. So Romulus came up with a pretty ruthless plan. He invited a neighboring tribe, the Sabines, over for a big festival. And while the Sabine men were watching the festivities, the Roman soldiers grabbed all their young women and carried them off to be forcibly married. It was seen as a brutal but necessary move to make sure the city survived.
So what's fascinating is that this same ruthless, pragmatic mindset eventually turned on the idea of kings. The Romans got tired of being ruled by one person with absolute power, and they engineered something new: the Republic. This was their shot at building a stable, powerful political machine.
So in 509 BCE, things came to a head. A nobleman named Brutus leads this revolt against the last king, a real tyrant named Tarquinius, and in his place they created a republic, all summed up by these 4 letters: SPQR. It stood for the Senate and the people of Rome. It meant power belonged to the citizens, not one guy. The very word for king, rex, became the worst insult you could throw at someone. And what they built was, for the time, totally revolutionary. No more king. Now you had a senate of elected officials. After a lot of protest from the regular folks, they even created something called the 12 Tables, a written code of law. This was a huge deal. It meant the rules were written down for everyone to see, so leaders couldn't just make things up. And now, people felt like they were fighting for their republic. And for a while, this new republic was working pretty well. But then, disaster. In 390 BCE, tribes of Gauls came storming down from the north, completely crushed the Roman army, and burned the city of Rome to the ground. It was a total, absolute humiliation, and it made the Romans realize their part-time citizen army just wasn't going to cut it anymore.
But the Roman response was, well, it was classic Rome. They learned from it, and they rebuilt bigger and stronger. They built massive new walls around the city, and, crucially, they totally reinvented their military. This is when the famous Roman legions were born, a permanent, professional army of paid soldiers. They were brutally disciplined, brilliantly organized, and they became the most terrifyingly effective fighting force the world had ever seen.
Here's the twist though. This perfect, unstoppable war machine they built to protect the Republic, it had a fatal flaw.
The legions became so powerful, so loyal to their generals, that they eventually became too powerful for the Republic itself to control.
And the person who really embodies this change is, of course, Julius Caesar. Just look at that number. Over 1 million people killed during his conquest of Gaul. This campaign made him incredibly rich and famous, but more importantly, it gave him an army that was loyal to him, personally, not to the politicians back in Rome.
So back in Rome, the Senate is watching this, and they are terrified. They see Caesar and his loyal army, and they're convinced he's going to make himself king. So a group of them, led by another man named Brutus, corner him and assassinate him. Brutus claimed he had to do it to save the Republic, but it didn't work at all. Instead of saving it, he kicked off the final, bloodiest civil war yet. And when the dust finally settled, one man was left standing, Caesar's adopted son, Octavian. He crushes all his enemies, and in 27 BCE, he's given a new name, Augustus. He was smart enough not to call himself a king, but make no mistake, he had absolute power. After 500 years, the Roman Republic was dead. The Roman Empire had begun. And just like that, the empire was born. And look, it would have centuries of unbelievable power, and for a while, even peace. But that internal rot we talked about, it didn't just disappear. It was still there, eating away at the foundations of this new empire, which was now built on the power of one man and his army.
I mean, this right here tells you everything you need to know about how unstable things got. For the first 200 years or so of the empire, you had 14 emperors. Pretty stable. But look at the next 100 years. 70. Basically, the army that built the empire was now tearing it apart from the inside, assassinating emperors and auctioning off the throne to the highest bidder. It was complete and utter chaos.
And this complete political chaos was just one piece of the puzzle. That gigantic army cost a fortune, which led to an economic crisis. The rich were living in absurd luxury, while the poor had nothing. And their whole economy was built on slave labor, which meant there were no jobs for regular citizens. The very things that made Rome great, its army and its conquests, were now gutting it from the inside. By the time outside tribes started to really push on the borders, Rome was already a hollowed-out shell, just waiting to collapse in 476 CE.
And that's where the story of Rome gets, well, a little uncomfortable. It presents us with this timeless question: can a nation's greatest strength, its overwhelming military power, actually become the very thing that leads to its own downfall? It makes you look around at the world today and ask a pretty tough question. It's something to think about for sure.